Right. Assalamualaikum. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, sir.
Morning, sir.
Semua okay?
Okay, sir.
So, kamu punya apa ni? Tarik untuk final exam sudah keluar kah? Guys,
Macam belum ada, sir.
belum ada. So, for non-final exam lah baru yang keluar tarikan. Yang non-final macam keluar sudah tarik dia. Maybe you guys can ask lah from the lecturer for subjects that does not involve final exam. Rasanya memang keluar sudah tertarik ya. Tapi for ADS510 ini ada final exam kan, so maybe that's why lah. Okay, right now we are at chapter number 6, right? International conflict. In the previous chapter, we discussed about security and power, right? So this is just another extension from what we have learned in the past topics. It's just that for this one, it zoomed in particularly to international conflict. Okay, so you guys are learning or studying about international politics. Before that, can you hear my audio clearly, voice clearly?
Yes, can, sir.
Okay, so you guys are studying about international politics. Whether you like it or not, international politics mainly shaped by conflict, right? So whenever you come across the issues of international politics, mostly it involves conflict that happen between country and how do they address that. That's what makes up international relation. They use diplomacy, they use many different means to address a conflict that happened that involve them. Okay, so whether you like it or not, conflict is something that is inevitable in international relation. Okay, it's a matter of how do you address, how do you solve the conflict, how do you find common ground to make sure that all parties involved are satisfied with the proposed solution, right? So that's basically about international conflict and its role in international politics, right? So I've already shared all of the slides in the Telegram group, okay, up to chapter number 10. So please download all of the slides and read before you enter class. Since I've already shared all of the slides last week, I expect everyone to have already read the slides, and I expect more interaction this morning, right? So let's continue with the next slide. So what is conflict? What is violence? What is war? Right? So the current conflict that gained international media attention, for instance, the Ukraine-Russia conflict, right? How it affects the global supply chain. You see, when we talk about politics, right, it does not only cause a problem to parties involved in that conflict. It also creates spillover effect mostly to neighboring country, and sometimes it creates global effect that cause countries from other continent to also impact from the conflict that happened in their country. For instance, right now, the sudden increase in commodities price, right? Produk, contoh minyak semua. Kenapa? Sebab global supply chain, logistic issue. Right now kita punya kos sara hidup suddenly meningkat. So it's not only about domestic politics, it also involves international politics because we rely on these suppliers from other countries. If they say they experience political instability, that will also hamper the economic transaction that involve all parties, right? So conflict, violence, and war basically happen because of incompatibility, which means clash of interest. That means if I have something that I want and you also want the same thing, and only one parties can get that particular matters, then it cause incompatibility to occurs, right? So if we cannot find common ground, if we cannot get both party on the same page, that's when conflict, violence, or war occurs. Okay. So let's look at the definition of conflict. So the definition of conflict is a social progress when two or more parties perceive a divergence of interest, yeah, clash of interest, or incompatible goals or value. Okay, I think every time we have class, I reiterate, emphasize again the basic, okay, the basic issues that dictate political behavior of a state is the national interest. Okay, so when we have a national interest and then we cannot get that national interest, we are forced to use the any means available to make sure that that interest can be attained. Okay, so that depends on the a lot of factor, whether you're a small state, you're a big state, itu pun akan mempengaruhi jenis-jenis tindakan kamu. Okay, so incompatibility is something that is inevitable because we have limited resources, tapi banyak yang mau. Ada sumber yang sedikit, tapi banyak pihak yang mau. Jadi obviously incompatibility cannot be avoided. Okay, subjective side, process of perception, cognition, communication, and emotion. So this one explain about the thought process. Okay, the thought process that explain the decision to make the country enter into conflict or war. Okay, this one heavily relied on the individual that become the leader of the country. Okay, how macam mana dia berfikir, dia punya thought process, apa persepsi dia, because persepsi ini is something that is subjective. Okay, different individu, different leader, they have different aspiration. Some individu, some leader are more inclined towards aggressive method, aggressive foreign policy, and some other are more of a liberal leader. For instance, you can see that from the you can observe that looking at the foreign policy during Mahathir era and Badawi era. One more aggressive and the later more liberal. Okay, so that's about the thought process, how they use their cognition, cognitive, the way they think, and their perception, helping them making decision on behalf of the country. Because at the end of the day, everything that's come up from the leader's mouth, the prime minister or president mouth, that represent the stance of the country. Okay, and then behavioral interaction between the parties. That's why I said, okay, you are not only looking at national interest and whatnot, you are also looking at who you against. Okay, siapa yang kamu lawan nih, right? So that's why you do a little bit of cost benefit analysis. Macam contoh kalau di sekolah dulu kamu tanyakan, ya nih saya boleh makan kah? Tidak, macam itulah. Okay, yang mana kamu tengok pilihan-pilihan tindakan kamu, your foreign policy option on table adalah based on who you against siapa, macam tu. Okay, and then who do you think can support you from your circle, maybe your alliance. Okay, so all of that plays into factor to decide the dynamic of the conflict. Okay, just like what happened in Ukraine and Russia. Okay, Ukraine begging, yeah, to the point of begging for NATO to partake, to interfere in the ongoing conflict with Russia. Okay, and the current development is Ukraine formally get the application to become a member of NATO officially tabled, and not yet decided, tapi baru dicadangkan lah. So that's another progress in conflict lah, right? So multiple level of analysis, interpersonal, group, intergroup, organizational, international, and global. When you want to look at conflict, conflict ni happen at micro level, makro, or even meso. Okay, dia boleh berlaku di peringkat individu, di peringkat negara, di peringkat antara bangsa, right? So it happen even in your daily life, right? So it depends. In international relation, if you use the neoclassic realism, okay, neoclassic realism is realism policy that focuses on foreign policy option. Yeah? They look at individual, domestic, and international level because different level involve different variables, different factor. Okay, so you cannot pukul rata all level of analysis. Setiap level of analysis tu looking at different issues, right? So conflict is defined as an actual or perceived opposition of needs, values, and interests. When it involves about incompatibility, it mainly based on cognitive. How do you perceive that incompatibility? Okay, so a liberal leader would see that as an opportunity to extend their areas of cooperation. But an aggressive leader, a realist leader, would want to engage in war because realist leaders usually tend to create a zero sum game situation, which means only one party will prevail. Okay, zero sum game means when incompatibility happen antara dua pihak, hanya satu pihak saja yang akan menang at the expense of the other parties. Okay, so realists would usually resort to extreme measure, for instance, coercive measures like war and pressure. Tapi kalau liberal, orang more on positive sum game, which means they try to look at the positive perspective where this might be an opportunity for us to extend, okay, or expand our areas of cooperation. Okay, so it heavily depends on how do you perceive that incompatibility. Macam mana kamu melihat ketidak incompatibility ini, macam mana cakap benda yang kamu berebut lah, begitulah, ya. So a conflict can be internal within oneself or external between two or more individual. Okay, so conflict ni within oneself, we usually use this type of analysis when we look at the decision maker. Okay, for instance, we look at his upbringing, his political ideology, his influence, and whatnot. Okay, within oneself. Whereas for external, you're looking at the political behavior, right? Conflict as a concept can help explain many aspects of social life, such as social disagreement, conflict of interest, fight between individual, group, or organization. So in political terms, conflict can refer to war, revolution, or other struggle, which may involve the use of force in the term armed conflict. Okay, so it's not only about war. War usually happen interstate. Okay, melibatkan antara negara. Revolution usually happen intrastate. Okay, civil war, for instance, is an example of revolution that happen in a country. Okay, or ada juga revolution peringkat antara bangsa, for instance, Arab Spring. Okay, that's one example of revolution from one Middle East country to another. Okay, and other struggles, struggle for independence, struggle for identity, and many more, in which we will discuss in more detail in the later slide. So conflict meaning disagreement, clash, argument, quarrel, yeah? Okay, more or less the same, okay? So how do we define violence? The intentional use of physical force or power, threaten or actual against oneself, another person, or against a group of community that either result in or has a high likelihood of resulting in injury, health, psychological harm, maldevelopment, or deprivation. Okay, so first of all, it's intentional. It's not something that you do unintentionally. Kamu memang mau buat benda tu, and it creates tension, threatening the other parties, and the output usually resulted in casualty, right? So those are the three main elements that involve in a conflict or violence: intention, process, and output. Okay. So what is the definition of war? So previously we discussed about conflict, and now we're looking at the definition of war, open and declared armed hostile conflict between states or nation. Okay, usually when you enter into war, you declare, okay, officially that you are entering a war. Okay, any conflict between rival groups by force of arm or other means recognized as a legal conflict, an act of force to compel the enemy to do our will. So war usually occurs when you want to make sure that the other parties follow your will. Okay, because it happened in the first place because of the incompatibility. So that means either side pun tidak mahu mengalah. Jadi kita cuba menggunakan kekerasan untuk menundukkan orang dengar cakap kita, right? So there are four types of war. First of all, interstate war, war between two or more states. In the past, these were the focus of most research. They are the easiest to study and have caused the most damage. So this one explain about the World War One, World War Two, and all of the war that occurs prior to Cold War. Okay, so during that time, most of international relation discussion revolve around interstate war because no or little or no attention at all was put to non-traditional threat. Okay, so at that time kita punya fokus perbincangan politik antara bangsa itu hanya berkisar tentang perang di antara negara sahaja sehingga Cold War. Tapi selepas Cold War, kita sudah tidak berfokus kepada interstate war sahaja, kita juga berfokus kepada non-traditional threat like piracy, kidnap for ransom, stateless, global recession, and whatnot that could also threaten international sovereignty. Okay, so interstate war ni dominates the international politics until Cold War. Okay, and then we also have intrastate war, war between group within the state with or without international participation. While the number of ongoing interstate war has declined, the decline has been less precipitous than the decline in interstate war. Okay, so intrastate war means civil war, war that happened in a country, usually because of the apa uh, uh, apa insurgent group, ya, yang looking at the possibility to gain independence for their own territory, or pursuing autonomy for their own areas, those kind of issue. Okay, separatist group and all that. For instance, we have during Pol Pot, there were a lot of attempt to topple him down. Okay, Pol Pot in Cambodia, and then Hun Sen as well. During Hun Sen era, the same goes in Thailand, yeah. When Yingluck get toppled down and all that. Okay, so intrastate war basically focus on the conflict that occurs in a country. Sometimes it also involves other foreign element. For instance, the neighboring country trying to be the mediator to solve the issue. But most of the time, due to the principle of sovereignty in the Westphalian Treaties 1648, countries try to avoid from interfering in any domestic affair of another sovereign states. Okay, so total war, war involving multiple great power. Total war includes significant destruction and loss of life. Since the end of World War II, total war has become less frequent. The number of countries participating in total war has fallen, and they tend to last for shorter length of time. This has led to some argue that this type of war is obsolete. Okay, so interstate war usually happen in an isolated cases. Okay, whereas total war in a mega scale, which involve great powers. Okay, so what separates interstate war and the total war adalah the magnitude of the conflict, right? And then for limited war, the objective is not surrender and occupation of enemy territory, but rather to attain limited goals. The Korean War, Gulf War, conflict in Sudan and Sierra Leone are example of limited war, which means they enter into the war or conflict because of a specific objective. So once they attain the objective, then the war ended. Okay, like in the Korean War, it's about the reunification of the Korean Peninsula. Okay, right now, Korean War remain as the only country that still masih lagi dipisahkan oleh utara dan selatan. Okay, Jerman sudah bersatu, Vietnam pun sudah bersatu, Korea sahaja yang belum bersatu. Okay, that's why we refer to that war as limited war. Okay, war for reunification of Korean Peninsula to mitigate the political differences between those two countries. So conflict and war. In international relation, conflict generally refer to armed conflict. Okay, armed conflict melibatkan senjata. War, when actor use force to resolve a dispute. So if you still remember in realism, we discussed about how realism emphasized on the importance to attend national interest and the end justify the means, which means you are allowed to use whatever means necessary, even if that requires you to kill other people to attain your national interest. Okay, so when that happens, tension cannot be subdued because everyone at constant feeling cautious all the time. So semua pun sentiasa berhati-hati. Jadi ketegangan itu tidak pernah subdued lah. Okay, specialists in IR and political science have proposed various theories seek to explain cause of war in order to explain how some dispute become violent and others do not. Okay, so right now with globalization and the mushrooming of all sort of international organization, we can see a steep decline in terms of conflict and wars that happen in today's context. But before, during the World War One and World War Two, we have ineffective international organization, foreign policy, machinery, political tools are not efficient and whatnot. That's why conflict and wars occurs frequently. Okay, tapi sekarang kita sudah ada banyak international organization, international treaty, which help us to create international norms, norma antarabangsa. Okay. So basically, international conflict is about perception. There are two schools of thought analyzing international conflict. The first one is idealism, and the second one is realism. Can anyone tell me apa main argument pasal idealism and realism? This one is in chapter number 4, right? Theory of International Relation. Idealism ni cakap pasal apa? And realism cakap pasal apa? Anyone? Idealism progress towards peace. Okay. Lagi? Benar? Realism pasal rebut kuasa, sir. Okay. Ada lagi? Ada lagi? Anyone would like to try? Okay, so sini kita ada si Dona sama Rahman. Dona bilang idealism is progress towards peace. Okay, idealism ni cakap semuanya dalam keadaan yang, sekejap tengok chat dulu. Realism is that nation are always in state of anarchy. Betul ke, Ustaz? Okay. Oh, macam mana nak tutup? Okay, so progress kan, progress towards peace. Okay, betul. Idealism ni cakap di dalam international politik ni, idealism means that in a perfect world. Itu saja dia punya keyword. In a perfect world, dalam dunia yang sempurna ni, semuanya boleh diselesaikan. Konflik boleh diselesaikan melalui perbincangan. Tidak, maksudnya idealism tidak perlu semua peperangan semua ni, sebab mereka melihat pembuat-pembuat keputusan ini sebagai rational actor. Jadi kalau berlaku incompatibility, it is not necessary to enter into war. We can use other means like negotiation, confidence building measure, foreign policy, diplomacy, and whatnot, sebagai satu kaedah untuk menyelesaikan masalah yang berlaku in a perfect world. Okay? Whereas for realism cakap, yang si Rahman bilang sini, realism pasal rebut kuasa. Dia cakap ni basically pasal power struggle. Sebenarnya rebut kuasa tu berlaku juga di dalam idealism and liberalism. Cumanya realism ni cakap memang peperangan itu tidak akan berlaku biarpun ada power struggle, sampailah pada waktu di mana wujud incompatibility, barulah peperangan itu akan berlaku. Okay, kalau semua sudah puas hati dengan status quo itu, tidak ada keperluan untuk berperang dalam realism pun. Kalau sudah masing-masing puas hati, saya kuasa macam ni, kau kuasa macam ni, kau pegang area ni, saya pegang area ni. Jadi dalam that kind of arrangement yang semua sudah berpuas hati, even in realism cakap pun tak perlu berperang. Cuma orang cakap ni, perang itu satu keperluan, kemestian apabila ada satu keadaan di mana ada pihak yang tidak mahu mengalah. Okay, so only under such situation that war and conflict become necessitated. Okay, so as far as it is really talk about conflict all the time. Okay, so because realism they justify their action by looking at the system as an anarchy system. So using their logic, they look at such situation as requiring an alpha in the political jungle. Okay, maksudnya dia cakap tu dalam keadaan yang berbentuk anarki ni, kan dia cakap political animal kan. Kita perlu di dalam satu hutan ni yang dipenuhi dengan political animal, perlu ada satu alpha, okay, yang menjadi kuasa yang ditakuti lah oleh negara-negara yang lain di dalam politik tu. That's why dia cakap tentang konflik. So bila alpha ni wujud dalam bentuk hegemon power, jadi dia akan mewujudkan newly established status quo. Okay, jadi peace itu boleh berlaku dalam keadaan yang macam tu, right? So that's why we have the theories that we learned last week about unipolar structure, bipolar structure, and multipolar structure. It's about creating, okay, the hierarchy ataupun political arrangement in the international politics. Okay. Philosophy from Locke and Hobbes. Liberal believe can international conflict can be solved, okay, by John Locke, and realism say cannot, okay, Thomas Hobbes, right? So causes of international conflict. So here we have the one of the neorealism scholars, Kenneth Waltz. Each state pursue its own interests, however defined, in way it judge best. Force is a means of achieving the external end of state because there exists no consistent, reliable process of reconciling the conflict of interest that inevitably arise among similar units in a condition of anarchy. Because if you still remember, neorealism yang Kenneth Waltz introduced ni sebenarnya melihat kepada macam mana struktur antarabangsa itu mewujudkan top-down pressure, okay, daripada keadaan yang berlaku di international politik itu mewujudkan top-down pressure yang membentuk tingkah laku politik negara-negara di international politik, okay. So Kenneth Waltz in his book, Main State and War, he introduced 4 different levels: individual level, domestic level, interstate level, and global level. Okay, this one, another name for this adalah the mirroring analysis. Okay, it could be ethnic, religion, or anything that can create unhappiness and disagreement. Okay, so at the individual level, why conflict turn violent? Okay, it revolves around rationality issue. That's why I said at the individual level, you want to look at the government. You want to look at the who's the prime minister or the president. What is his background? Okay, what is his political ideology? What is his rationale in making decision? Okay, so itu melihat kepada individual level. For instance, I actually wrote an article about this ya in one of my article yang menggunakan this three level of analysis. Contohnya yang masa Najib Razak tuh, kamu tengok dia punya foreign policy berkenaan dengan China tuh banyak dipengaruhi oleh dia punya domestic political legitimacy. Okay, because at that time people starting to doubt his legitimacy due to his foreign policy with China. Orang melihat pada waktu itu dia punya kestabilan kedudukan dia itu agak goyah di mana orang mempertikaikan tindakan dia seolah-olah menurut kata negara China. And to make matters worse, because of the IMDb issue. Jadi orang cuba melihat macam mana tingkah laku politik dia itu dipengaruhi oleh cubaan dia untuk menyelamatkan his political career, right? So that helped to explain his foreign policy actually, ya. So itu contoh at the individual level in Malaysia China bilateral relation. Okay, why conflict and violent at individual level? For example, Saddam Hussein. Okay, Saddam Hussein is an example of that because of other Western country. They do not actually prefer Saddam Hussein to be the leader at that time, yeah, because of political ideology and differences and whatnot. Jadi when that happened, jadilah berlaku NATO, US and Britain penetrate and kill Saddam Hussein using drone and whatnot. Yeah, so itu contoh at individual level. First theory based on realism, the use of war and violent means of leverage in international conflict is normal and a rational decision made by leader. Okay, so this one is based on the realism theory. Then the second theory, conflict occurs because of deviation from rationality, which means the error in decision making. Okay, so sometimes you cannot deny that we cannot be rational all the time. Okay, so obviously the assumption in international politics is that the leaders always make rational decision. But can they? Boleh gak orang sebagai manusia sentiasa buat rational decision making? Tidak, sebab dia ada factors that may also influence their decision making. Okay, maybe for instance nepotism ke ataupun any kind of factors yang boleh mengganggu orang punya keputusan yang berbentuk rational. Sebab manusia ni kita punya nature, kita punya karakteristik memang tidak boleh rational sepanjang masa. Jadi bila berlaku error in decision making, that creates opportunity for conflict to occurs. Okay? And then the third theory, the education of population determine whether conflict become violent. You are looking at the social class. Okay, remember in liberalism, they want to make sure that we can create as many civil society as possible. Okay, the M40 lah in Malaysian context. Okay, if let's say they failed to do that, okay, that means the government or the leader have full power to make decision. Sebabnya negara peringkat bawah rakyat tidak tahu apa yang berlaku. For instance, during Pol Pot era ya, General Pol Pot, apa yang berlaku? Dia bunuh semua civil war yang ada di negara dia sebab Pol Pot ni adalah pemerintah kuku besi. Jadi dia bunuh semua yang golongan bijak pandai untuk membolehkan dia buat keputusan yang tidak akan dipertikaikan. Sebab yang tinggal pada waktu itu adalah golongan yang tidak berpendidikan. Okay, so itu menunjukkan apabila ada banyak golongan tidak berpendidikan dan kurang golongan yang berilmu, konflik itu lebih mudah terjadi. Okay, tapi sekiranya kumpulan yang berilmu ni M40 lah selalunya ya, civil society, diorang boleh menjadi watchdog ataupun observer to evaluate the government performance. Jadi the government pun agak risau dengan orang punya political survival. Jadi mereka lebih berteliti dalam pembuatan keputusan. Okay, so quick recap. First theory menyatakan bahawa leaders always rational in making decision. Second theory menyatakan bahawa sometimes there can be an error in decision making because leaders cannot be rational all the time. And the third one, looking at the demography, whether they are literate population or illiterate population. Okay, and then we're looking at the domestic level, attention to the features of states or society that make them more or less prone to violence in resolving conflict. Okay, so one example is Marxist, Marxism, the aggressive and greedy capitalist versus Western expansionist, ideological and totalitarian nature of communist states. Okay, if you still remember, we have discussed about this before. In Marxism, they're looking at the social hierarchy, social class between the core country, semi-periphery country, and periphery country. Basically, in more simpler terms, kita gunakan term industrial country, non-industrial country, dengan middle country. Okay, negara-negara industri, negara-negara besar lah. Negara-negara non-industrial ni negara-negara third world country. Lepas tu dengan negara-negara middle country ni selalunya adalah penghubung di antara negara industrial dengan negara third world country. Okay, macam mana very manipulative di industrial country manipulate resources in third world country. Okay, so domestic political factors shape the state outlook on war or peace. Political parties, interest group, and legislature play imperative role. Okay, so this one we are looking at the political demography. Okay, so we are looking at the aspiration, di perjuangan setiap political parties itu. Adakah based on ethnicity? Adakah based on development? Apa sebenarnya orang punya aspirasi? Adakah based on youth and whatnot? Okay, and then interest group basically referring to the NGOs. Okay, NGOs, they help to create a balance, between the government agenda and the people's agenda, because they serve as the watchdog to pressure the government whenever they think that the government policy does not align with the people's will. Okay, and then legislature looking at the rules and regulation. Okay, basically in our country, our rules and regulation are based on the constituent. Okay, constituency. Some society changed totally. Like Japanese during the World War II used to be violent, but now peaceful. Because again, remember the treaty that they signed with United States caused the nuclear attack. Okay, the United States gave them another opportunity to develop their country post the nuclear war, nuclear attack. Tapi under the condition that Japanese can only develop their economic and social sector and not their military development. Okay, pada waktu itu Japanese menandatangani satu perjanjian dengan Amerika selepas peristiwa serangan nuklear itu, yang mana menyatakan termanya adalah Japanese hanya boleh memajukan negara mereka dalam sektor ekonomi dan sosial saja, tetapi tidak boleh menyentuh sektor military. Okay, so basically United States tolong dorang lah pada waktu itu, right? So before that, sebelum nuclear attack tu, Japan pun adalah negara penjajah juga kan. And then interstate level, explain war in terms of power relation among major IR actors. So current focus, effect of democracy, government structure, trade, international organization, related factor explaining the escalation, settlement of militarized interstate dispute. Okay, so this one we are looking at the political ideology. Okay, yang ni disebut demokrasi, government structure, trade, international organization. Kalau contoh gunakan demokrasi, kita tengoklah demokrasi, free election, laissez-faire, and then the establishment of international organization, semuanya yang align dengan liberal principle. Okay, kalau kita melihat kepada realis, demokrasi tidak wujud, government structure ini wujud sebagai satu entity yang superior, semua begitu. Jadi ia berdasarkan political ideology apa yang kamu gunakan adopt in your administration. Okay, so when you engage in interstate war, kamu kena melihat kepada power relation tu. Jadi di dalam sesuatu peperangan tu jarang berlaku yang mana wujudnya kuasa yang sama kuat. Mesti ada satu pihak yang lebih kuat daripada pihak yang lain. Okey, kuat bukan bermaksud kuat dari segi ketenteraan, kuat dari pelbagai sudut. Mungkin kuat dari segi population size, mungkin kuat dari sudut economic influence, mungkin juga kuat memang dari sudut military and whatnot. So we have to consider all that when engaging the level of capability for an individual country, right? So we have few theories in the interstate level. The first one, power transition theory, holds that conflict generates massive war. Okay, when power is relatively equally distributed and rising power is threatened to overtake a declining hegemony. Okay, so this first theory basically used the assumption in the Thucydides trap, ya, yang mana dia menyatakan bahawa di mana satu situasi yang berlaku ada kuasa hegemoni dan ada kuasa rising power, itu adalah satu bentuk Thucydides trap yang mana menyatakan pasti akan wujud konflik, because yang rising power ini akan cuba menjatuhkan hegemon power. Okay? So, yang ini kamu boleh baca Thucydides trap, ya. Yang itu panjang lagi cerita dia. Tapi itu dia punya gist tu basically macam tu, yaitu di mana situasi berlaku power struggle di antara hegemon power and rising power. So that's why looking at the current situation that we have right now, even though we have unipolar structure, unipolar structure lah, yang mana US become the sole hegemon power, tapi we have rising power yaitu China. Jadi people they started to analyze the situation using the Thucydides trap. Okay, yang mana China ni akan cuba untuk menjatuhkan US. So macam itulah. Then second one, deterrence. Supposed to stop war by building power and threatening its use. But theory of arm race shows this method is causing more war and not preventing it. So deterrence ni basically idea dia adalah kami meningkatkan kekuasaan kami, military capability kami sebagai satu kaedah supaya kalau kamu serang kami, kamu tahu akibat yang akan jadi dengan kamu. So deterrence ni maksudnya adalah kita secara openly declare that we do not want any conflict, but if you dare to attack us, then be prepared for the consequences. So knowing that, people will start to become more cautious to not get into conflict with that particular power sebab kita takut dia punya consequences. Tapi benda ni sebenarnya bila dia ugut kita macam tu, kita pun akan cuba meningkatkan kita punya keupayaan ketenteraan. It creates security dilemma. Okay, deterrence ni dia punya objektif adalah untuk buat orang tidak kacau kamu. Tapi at the same time dia juga mewujudkan security dilemma. Bila security dilemma berlaku, kami tahu yang kamu kuat, jadi kami pun mesti kasih kuat ketenteraan kami. Jadi kami pun tingkatkan kami punya pembelian senjata-senjata api semua supaya kami bersedia sekiranya apa-apa berlaku. Jadi it creates unrest, it creates tension, and the probability for war to take place become higher. Okay, so deterrence memang objektifnya itu adalah untuk tidak berlaku konflik. Tapi kesannya banyak yang scholars yang menyatakan instead of tidak membuatkan konflik berlaku, dia menjadi satu bentuk perangsang pula untuk konflik menjadi lebih berkemungkinan untuk berlaku. Okay. And then several theory proposed. First, cyclical, long economic wave, kind of hegemony of US, maybe 50 years or 100 years. Okay, and the second one, linear long-term change. War conflict lesser due to development, information, and international norm. War become obsolete as leverage in international conflict. Two powerful weapons can't be used, highly complex and interdependent world. So linear long-term change ni basically referring to the globalization that we can observe right now. Okay, so first of all, because of globalization, access to information become much easier these days. Yeah. So when people become more literate, they get access to information, to political development in other country. They become more literate. They know what to do and what not. They have discussion with communities from other countries. So this kind of interaction makes conflict become harder to take place. Yeah, and then international norm, because these days we have a lot of international organization that initiate conference, yeah, and whatnot, that helps to foster or facilitate more treaties. Okay, so for each and every individual treaties, they address specific issue. For instance, haze issue. We have in ASEAN transboundary haze agreement between ASEAN countries. Indonesia become a member, a participant in that treaty in 2014, in which it outlines several proposals or solution to his issue in Indonesia. Okay, so it creates international norm. Jadi apa yang kita propose dalam treaty itu dia menjadi satu bentuk norma antarabangsa. Jadi bila ada norma antarabangsa, dia mempengaruhi tingkah laku negara-negara ini. Okay, that's why pentingnya perjanjian-perjanjian antarabangsa ni dia mewujudkan international norm. All these international treaty it helps to establish international norm. So before that, sebelum kita ada international treaty, everyone are free to do whatever they want to do because there were no international norms. Tapi after ada international treaty ini, kita sudah banyak perkara do's and don'ts yang kita sudah mutually agree in the international treaty. So basically kita dapat control lah states behavior bila sudah ada international norms. Okay. Two powerful weapons can't be used, okay, because of international treaty as well. For instance, the CNWFZ, okay, perjanjian yang mana tidak boleh membangunkan nuclear power, kan? So in UN as well, I don't remember the name right now, but ada stipulated in the UN agreement about how countries nowadays are no longer allowed to develop their nuclear power. So what you see in some countries where develop their nuclear power itu adalah tindakan berani mati. Itu yang sendiri-sendiri saya buat tuh. That's why banyak yang buat secara senyap-senyap. Sebabnya ada international norm yang mana menyatakan tidak boleh membangunkan nuclear power. Okay? Highly complex and interdependent world because of globalization, laissez-faire, open market. Global supply chain is an example of interdependent world. Yeah, so all that. Previously, war was seen as normal. Now it is distasteful. Just like slavery and dueling used to be a normal practice, now it is obsolete. Okay, so in the early days, this kind of war is very common. Okay, it was very common. Di peringkat rakyat pun orang tidak rasa benda itu sebagai satu yang distasteful pada peringkat awal. Tapi as people become more literate, become more knowledgeable, they started to see how that become a violation of human right. So that's how it become from a normal practice to something that people perceive as distasteful. Okay, the same goes for slavery as well. Even in Tanah Melayu, before we have this practice, slavery. But after time passed by, with all the introduction of human rights and whatnot, it's suddenly being perceived as obsolete right now. Yeah? But in reality, there is still war, but shorter and less frequent, but more destructive. Okay, so very temporary. For instance, the Arab Spring and in Timor-Leste, a much shorter conflict, but more destructive. Okay, war may be obsolete, but occurs with great frequency. Right. Okay, cause of world's three level of analysis. Okay, this one more or less like the previous one. Yeah. And then let's look at typologies of international conflict. Do you guys need 5 minute break? Let's have 5 minute break, yeah? And after that, we return and continue with the conflict of ideas slide. right? So can we continue?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so conflict of ideas. Okay, so there are 6 types of international conflict outlined here. The first one is ethnic. Obviously, ethnic become the cause of conflict uh, uh, in many countries. For instance, in Myanmar, the Rohingya issue. Okay, they get deprived of their human right needs because of the difference in ethnicity. Okay, another example would be the Holocaust, where Hitler uh, mass massacre of Jewish people, and even right now you see a lot of anti-Semitism sentiment towards Jewish people. So that's another example of ethnic conflict. And then we also have religious conflict. Okay, conflict due to religious differences in Israel Palestine. Another example of religious conflict. We also have ideological conflict, like the one during Cold War. And then we also have a territorial conflict, for instance, the South China Sea issue, Petra Branca, Malaysia, Singapore, Sipadan, Malaysia, Indonesia, Pulau Layang-Layang, and all that. An example of territorial conflict. And then we also have governmental conflict, for instance, in Cambodia, in 1988, yeah, 1988, 1988, if I'm not mistaken, Cambodia, for the first time ever in their history, they have 2 prime ministers at the same time, Hun Sen and also Norodom Ranariddh, the son of Sihanouk, ya, orang punya raja. Okay, at that time they have 2 prime minister, Hun Sen and Ranariddh. Tapi the governmental conflict occurs when Hun Sen toppled down Ranariddh because he accused him of fraud in election and helping the terrorists in Cambodia at that time. And then we also have economic conflict, the ongoing economic war between US and China. So what happened at that time, US announced all sort of economic sanction towards a Chinese product. And it's also being reciprocal by China, who did the same thing. Okay, so most difficult type of conflict have intangible element such as ethnic hatred, religious fervor or ideology, all conflict of ideas. Okay, the same goes for the India issue. Okay, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Okay, previously they are all the same country but get separated because of ideologi. Ada juga sedikit pasal agama lah di sana tu. Okay, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Okay, this identity-based source of international conflict today have been shaped historically by nationalism, link between identity and internationally recognized statehood. Okay, nationalism, like the case in Timor Leste. Okay, where during the survey conducted by United Nations, the Timor-Leste people opt for total independence instead of authority from given by the Indonesian government during B.J. Habibie era. Okay, so that's one example of nationalism. Okay, next, banyak lagi lah sebenarnya. Nagorno-Karabakh itu di Armenia and Azerbaijan. Lepas tu kita juga ada conflict of interest, tangible source of conflict. Okay, so territorial dispute we have here Singapore, Philippines, Indonesia versus Malaysia. Means of controlling territory, military means most effective. So when we talk about territorial dispute kan sebenarnya ada banyak cara lah untuk dapat teritori ini. First, kalau tidak ada penduduk, kita boleh dapat teritori itu menggunakan kaedah kependudukan aktif. Okay, effective occupation in international law. You can claim that territory as your own if you can prove effective occupation. So how do you prove effective occupation? By building camps ataupun development in that particular area. Okay, yang menandakan itu adalah kawasan kamu. Just like in the case of Pedra Branca. So obviously in the Pedra Branca case, everyone knows that the Pedra Branca belongs to Malaysia. But the mistake that we made at that time is that we do not, okay, create effective occupation at that place. Instead, Singapore dorang buat effective occupation. So that's one issue. Another issue adalah bila Singapore buat effective occupation, dorang bina bangunan dorang di sana, Malaysia tidak bercakap apa-apa. So that's the second way of claiming a territory. Okay, silent. I don't remember the specific term lah, nama spesifiknya. Tapi kalau tempat itu diduduki oleh negara lain dan kamu berdiam diri itu adalah satu kaedah persetujuan juga. Maksudnya kalau kamu tidak cakap apa-apa, itu menandakan kamu bersetuju bahawa kependudukan itu diberikan kepada dorang. Okay, so that's two criteria that makes the Pedra Branca shift the ownership goes to Singapore. Okay, when it was owned by Malaysia, the island was called as Pulau Batu Putih. Tapi once the ownership transferred to Singapore, we are no longer allowed to refer to that island as Pulau Batu Putih. Right now, we have to refer to it as Pedra Branca because of the ownership issue. Okay. And then secession, province or region to secede from existing state. Example, Aceh, South Thailand, and South Philippines. Okay. So kita ada gerakan Aceh Merdeka in Aceh. And then South Thailand we have Pulo, okay, Pulo Group, Patani United Liberation Organization, if I'm mistaken. And then in South Philippines we have MILF, MNLF, Abu Sayyaf, and all that. Ya, semuanya ini adalah kawasan-kawasan yang bergolak, yang mana mereka mahukan total independence ataupun otonomi. So in GAM, Gerakan Aceh Merdeka in Aceh, they pursuing total independence. The same goes in South Thailand, di Pulau, dorang pun mahukan total independence. In South Philippines, MILF mahukan total independence, MNLF mahukan otonomi. Okay, so MNLF sudah berjaya dapatkan otonomi lah. Okay, yang mana pada waktu itu negara Malaysia sebagai mediator. Okay. Okay, so interstate border, for instance, the Iran-Iraq border in 1980, Soviet Union and China in 1969, and then we also have a lingering dispute, Israel borders, yeah, which involve Israel and Palestine. Okay, and then we also have territorial waters. Okay, so land areas sovereignty. Not only cover land areas, but also international waters and air. Okay, wilayah sebuah negara tidak hanya cover kawasan darat, tetapi juga laut dan udara. Okay.
So, kalau apa tuh? Kalau yang antara Ukraine sama Rusia tuh, yang dulu lah, bukan yang sekarang. Itu soal territorial dispute kah ataupun macam ideological dispute?
Okay, macam dalam kes Russia ni kan, dia sebenarnya menggunakan Ukraine ni sebagai satu bentuk, I would say buffer, okay, yang memisahkan dia dengan kawasan-kawasan yang dikuasai oleh golongan-golongan Western power ni. Okay, just like how they use Thailand in Southeast Asia before sebagai satu kaedah untuk memisahkan kawasan masing-masing. So obviously kalau kamu punya negara jiran adalah milik negara yang menjadi musuh kamu, jadi dia akan berlaku tension setiap masa. Jadi untuk mengelakkan benda itu berlaku, kita kena ada satu buffer, benteng. Itulah gunanya Ukraine ni. Sebab apa? Sebab Ukraine ni previously under in the USSR as one of the satellites under USSR alliances. Jadi bila sudah berpecah, kenapa berpecah? Sebab banyak yang tidak mahu ikut sudah ideologi dia kan. Jadi dia mendedahkan, okay? It makes Russian border security exposed to threat from the Western power. Jadi to make sure that they still have some sort of a wall, dorang gunalah Ukraine sebagai satu border. So that's why they are very consistent when it comes to Ukraine issue, yaitu mereka tidak mahu Ukraine ni menjadi sekutu kepada NATO from the early days until today. But still dia punya pendekatan masih sama pasal itu. Okay?
Oh, oke. So dia bukan soal teritorial lah.
Dia bukan soal teritorial, dia lebih soal keselamatan dorang punya national security. Actually di Rusia and Ukraine ni dia adalah kompleks isu sebenarnya, Budin. Cumanya kalau kita mahu letak apa faktor utama, apa faktor sub faktor dia, kalau sub faktor utama dia sememangnya untuk dorang punya national security. Sub faktor dia termasuklah dorang punya ethnicity, religion and all that lah begitu. Tapi yang pemangkin utama kenapa orang bertindak agresif kan adalah disebabkan mereka mahu mengekalkan Ukraine sebagai satu bentuk buffer yang memisahkan orang dengan kuasa-kuasa utama Eropa. Okay?
Alright, sir. Click that. Thank you.
Ada lagi ke soalan lain?
Sir, kalau yang macam isu di Lahad Datu dulu tu itu pasal territorial dispute juga kan, sir?
Yang Lahad Datu, mana Lahad Datu? Sulu.
Ya. Yang Filipina.
Sulu tu, yang Sulu tu memanglah dia pasal teritorial, tapi dia tu a bit unik sebab Sulu ni bukan kerajaan. So itu yang unik dia. Jadi kalau sebab Sulu ni bukan kerajaan, kita tidak boleh menggunakan ketenteraan kita sebenarnya. Kita hanya guna polis. Kalau kita guna ketenteraan, maksudnya kita mengakui kedaulatan kerajaan Sulu itu. Sedangkan Sulu itu bukan lagi kerajaan yang diiktiraf. Jadi dia bukan satu bentuk pertikaian dari international territorial dispute. Sebab condition, okay? Salah satu syarat untuk kamu terlibat, okay, dan di dalam territorial dispute adalah kamu mesti adalah sebuah kerajaan yang diakui, recognized government. In that case, Sulu bukan satu kerajaan yang diakui di Filipina. That's why kita tidak situasi itu tidak melibatkan territorial dispute. Itu lebih melibatkan individual claim towards territory in Malaysia lah. Okay, so Filipina pun yang ini yang menarik dia. Filipina ni mereka menggunakan kaedah silent policy, iaitu orang tidak mengiyakan, orang juga tidak mentidakkan dia. Sebab apa? Sebab ini adalah satu model politik di Filipina yang menggunakan isu-isu seperti ini sebagai satu political isu yang dimainkan during election. Jadi daripada Marcos Ferdinand sampailah bukan lagi Marcos Ferdinand, dari sebelum-sebelum itu lagi sampai sekarang, inilah model-model politik dia. Sekarang kan anak dia sudah si Bongbong sudah jadi presiden Filipina. Okay, selepas Rodrigo Duterte terms end, yang the next Philippine president will be Bongbong Ferdinand Jr. Okay, Marcos Ferdinand punya anak. Jadi isu Sulu yang serang Datu dulu tu bukanlah international territorial dispute in the sense that yang mengklaim itu bukan negara ataupun kerajaan yang diakui. Boleh?
Boleh, sir.
So that explain kenapa kita tidak guna tentera dulu. Orang gesa-gesa kerajaan untuk guna tentera kan? Tidak boleh. Kalau kita guna tentera, maksudnya kita mengakui kedaulatan orang sebagai sebuah kerajaan. That's why kita gunakan polis. Okay, any other question?
Sir.
Ya, Dona. Tidak?
Tidak, sir.
Oh, okay. So conflict of who control the national government cause different government with different approach, right? So always when there is a transition of power between one government, one administration to another, Okay, they will bring with them different aspiration, different way of governing the country. So, example, US and British, yeah, they use NATO, okay, to overrule Saddam, okay, because what they said, mereka cakap Saddam ni become protector and host country to terrorist group at that time. Okay, of course, whether or not it bear any truth to it remain to be seen, because tidak ada satu formal report that can give concrete evidence to their claim. Okay, so they simply use that as a justification to why they penetrate the Iraq country at that time. Okay, so it's about how they said they want to make sure liberally. Okay, so everyone in, semua sudah di dalam. Okay, kita tunggu kejap 2 minit tunggu yang lain masuk, baru 42 orang.
Okay, sir.
Right, so let's continue ya. Di mana yang putusnya tadi itu? Di ekonomi konflik kah? Okay, so economic conflict, most pervasive form of conflict, for example, fuel and coffee. Okay, so economic conflict become very detrimental, especially during this 21st century era. Okay, where you have high interdependence with other country. So when there is an economic conflict, then that would mean your economic sector would get impact heavily. Okay, so that would also mean less supply, less development, and whatnot, less employment opportunity, and all that. Yeah, so that's why economic conflict is something that you want to avoid at any cost, at all costs. Yeah. So, what are some of the factors to economic conflict? One example is mercantilism, foreign policy. Okay, so mercantilism is another sub theories under realism. So realism, they also have their very own theories when it comes to economic sector. Just like laissez-faire have, just like liberalism have laissez-faire concept. Just like Marxism focuses on economy and whatnot. Mercantilism is a realism theory that focuses on economy discussion. Okay, so mercantilism argument is very easy, simple. They want to make sure that they can accumulate wealth from other countries using economic transaction. So how do we do that? By making sure that our domestic economy can flourish at the expense of international player. Okay, one way is to make sure that our export is of higher volume compared to our import. Okay, so we want to make sure less product from outside of our country coming in and more of our product being marketed to outside consumers. Okay, secara mudahnya mercantilism menyatakan bahwa agenda utama dalam ekonomi adalah untuk memastikan negara mengumpul kekayaan melalui kerjasama ekonomi, transaksi ekonomi dengan negara luar. Dan yang paling penting adalah memastikan domestik punya economic sector berkembang at the expense of market-market luar negara, yaitu melalui import yang lebih tinggi berbanding dengan ekspor. Okay? So theory of lateral pressure expansion for economy, okay, and then military industry. Okay, so right now military industry is another very promising industry in the economic sector, especially countries with technology. Okay, so for smaller country, they usually bought their military technology daripada Second World War, daripada yang sudah terpakai sebab they cannot afford to buy new military equipment. Tapi for producing country like German, US, they have their very own companies yang develop this kind of product. In Malaysia, we have one. We do have one. I don't remember the name, but we do definitely have one company that focuses on this sector, this industry. But in terms of visibility, of course, companies from major power have more leverage lah, compared to our local companies in military industry. Okay, for instance, in Thailand, they have started to use a drone to replace human capital to oversee the borders operation. Okay, di Thailand, orang mula menggunakan drone untuk menggantikan atau complement human capital orang dalam mengawasi border orang. Jadi sebelum ni isunya adalah kekangan penguasa untuk mengawasi border di Thailand. Tapi sekarang mereka menggunakan drone. The same goes in Mexico as well. Okay, and there were some attempt from our own authorities to also incorporate drone usage in our border control. But as far as I know, we still do not have the budget to do that, because that will involve big budget lah to execute it. Okay, and then drug trafficking, massive illegal trade. Okay, yang mana when we talk about economic conflict, another promising industry adalah di black market, yaitu industri black market ni melibatkan kegiatan-kegiatan yang tidak sah di sisi undang-undang, like drugs, like weapon. Sebab di ada beberapa negara ni banyaknya orang ada akta senjata, jadi tidak boleh sesuka hati. Jadi banyak yang berdagang senjata ni di black market. The same goes for drugs, prostitute and all that. Yang mana kalau kita legalize dia, maka tax paying money itu akan lebih banyak dan menguntungkan negara. Tapi of course lah, ada beberapa isu yang perlu dipertimbangkan. Misalnya in our context, kita adalah negara Islam, kita berpandukan nilai-nilai Islam and all that, so itu juga satu isu. Di negara lain, prostitute adalah legal industry. The same goes for drugs, marijuana. Ya, di negara lain marijuana itu adalah legal. Di Belanda misalnya, kamu boleh dapatkan marijuana itu for recreation purpose. In Malaysia, kita still lagi tidak membenarkan penggunaan marijuana. So, like I said, sektor-sektor ini yang dibawa ke black market ini adalah satu kerugian dalam bentuk tax paying money. Tapi again, you have to look at our countries punya sistem, yang mana kita negara Islam, ada prinsipal and all that. Yeah? So conflict of ideas, intangible source of conflict. Okay, ethnic conflict, most difficult type of conflict, systematic dislike and hatred of one ethnic group to the other, because it's something that cannot be avoided, where one ethnicity feel more superior than the other ethnicity. Okay, it's about power struggle, it's about status quo. Okay, so obviously you feel more comfortable with someone who share the same genes, okay, as you, and you feel more distance to someone who you feel foreign. Okay, factors might be tangible like territorial control, Kurds, ya, minority in Turkey. Sekarang Turki sudah tukar nama, Iraq, Iran, and Syria. Okay, Kurds minority still the tension conflict there still happen until today. It's a protected issue. Cause of ethnic hostility, for instance, historical in Rohingya issue, the Myanmar government accused Rohingya people as illegal immigrants from Bangladesh. So they do not share the same ethnicity as the majority of Myanmar people. So that's why they are not recognized as a citizen of Myanmar. And the same goes for extended kinship feeling. In Rohingya, they have different colors to Myanmar people. They have a darker skin as compared to Myanmar community. So they live, their population concentrated in one areas only in Myanmar. So tempat tinggal pun concentrated di satu area. Dia mewujudkan satu jurang sosial di antara local people and the Rohingya people. And then ethnocentrism in group bias. Okay, so ethnocentrism ni adalah maksudnya melibatkan itulah yang saya cakap tu, yang kamu rasa kamu lebih hebat daripada negara lain tu, daripada bangsa lain tu. Okay, And then satu lagi adalah kita punya social hierarchy. Misalnya di India kasta kan, ada kasta tinggi, ada kasta rendah berdasarkan warna kulit yang lebih cerah, warna kulit yang lebih gelap. The same goes lah di Afrika, orang putih dengan orang hitam di Afrika. Orang putih dianggap sebagai golongan elit, dan orang hitam dianggap sebagai golongan slave. Okay, dasar apartheid ya di Afrika. And then religious conflict, religious regarded as core value system, differ, easy disdain, and treated others as unworthy or even inhuman. Okay, for instance, Pakistan and India, Azerbaijan and Armenian ni adalah Nagorno-Karabakh ya. And then Serbs, Bosnian and Albanian conflict ya, ni Bosnian conflict. And then distinction between believers versus infidels ya, Shia dengan Sunnah. Terrorist attack being said linked to religious conflict. Okay, for instance, ISIS yang dianggap sebagai pejuang Islam, sedangkan ISIS ni adalah radical group, and not all people agree with their approach, right? So, however, the Western people seems to think that the ISIS group represent all Muslim people, so that's a very wrong idea on their half, on their end, yeah. So itulah religious conflict. Okay, so religious conflict, because religion is the core of a community value system in much of the world. People whose religious practice differ are easily disregarded and treated as unworthy or even inhuman. Okay, Islamist movement, Islamist group. Okay, so religious conflict ni is one of the most one example of religious conflict adalah between the Israel and Palestine issue lah, which everyone are aware of. Okay, the development in Israel-Palestine issue. So itu yang salah satu contoh religious conflict lah, yang mana of course these Jewish people they seems to think that for many years they are being alienated in their own land. So once they have the opportunity, they take that opportunity and do the same thing as what they have experienced from before. So that's what they assume lah, right? And then on top of that, they have a lot of partners that backs their action. For instance, United States. So that give them some leverage over Palestine, because in United Nations, Palestine does not have alliance in the Security Council, those that have veto power. But for Israel, United States is their close alliance. Yeah. So whatever decision that goes against Israel interest, US can help by vetoing, yeah, veto the decision to overrule the decision. Okay. So that's an example of religious conflict. And then ideological conflict, communism and capitalism democracy. Communism adalah memberi kuasa kepada kerajaan pusat untuk disseminate the wealth to everyone equally, whereas for capitalism adalah liberal lah, yang mana siapa akan ada yang kaya menjadi semakin kaya, yang miskin menjadi semakin miskin. Okay, in liberalism, communism lah, capitalism ni liberalism punya demokrasi, open market, free market and all that. And then US hegemony and global governance. US hegemony based on superpower that oversee the operation of international politics. Global governance that works in the way that everyone are treated equally, and the action of states are mostly based on the international norms. And then we have the Nazis ideology, kan, anti-Semitism lah sebenarnya, yang orang paling kenal Nazi ni disebabkan anti-Semitism, yaitu Holocaust. And then Saddam Hussein ideology with his kuku besi punya approach, right? And then democracy and non-democracy. Okay, so itu ideology conflict, something that you cannot see. It's something that is intangible, tapi very destructive kalau berlaku. Okay, types of conflict by cause. Okay, Goldstein and Pfaffhaus distinguish 6 cause of conflict. Goldstein and Pfaffhaus ni, orang ada buku ya, falling into 2 fundamental categories. This cause can often overlap. Okay, conflict of ideas, ethnic, religious ideology, conflict of interest, territorial, governmental, and economic. So one tangible, the other adalah non-tangible. Okay. Right, so conflict of ideas, 6 types of international conflict. Just like in the previous slide, we separate these 6 into 2 main categories. Conflict that caused by ideas and that caused by interest. So most difficult type of conflict have intangible elements such as ethnic hatred, religious feeling or ideology, or conflict of ideas. Because when you want to solve the issue, you have to understand the sentiment from all parties. It involves cognitive. Dia melibatkan dari dalam, dia melibatkan pemikiran. Something yang kamu tidak boleh ubah secara fizikal. Okay? Tapi for territorial, governmental, economic, contohnya kalau territory, kalau kamu bagi dia punya ownership, settle. Tapi kalau idea, macam mana kamu mengubah pemikiran itu yang payah ada di situ. This identity, best source of international conflict today, have been shaped historically by nationalism, link between identity and internationally recognized statehood. Okay, so again, nationalism, modern statehoods, all become international norms post the Westphalian Treaty 1648. So that's why you can see all this territorial dispute, governmental conflict, economic recession, economic sanction, and all that only happen post the 1648 international treaties. Okay. So what do you think is the most important reason for international conflict among nations today? Can someone answer this question? Can someone answer this question? Berdasarkan kamu punya pemerhatian sendiri, apakah reason yang paling penting yang menyebabkan international conflict di antara negara pada hari ini? Economic power. Okay. Lagi? Ada lagi? Apa sebab dia kamu rasa?
Rasa kalau bagi saya why reasons for international conflict ni, first maybe about history lah, history of nations lah. Macam dia kalau kadang ada nation dia ada strong belief of orang punya history, so macam kadang tu move orang untuk adanya konflik lah. Macam rasa macam kalau Malaysia saya nak tahu lah, tapi kalau negara lain ada. Kalau dan satu lagi mungkin subculture, pertemuan culture, sebab mungkin ada international conflict.
Okay, so kalau tanya saya dan saya punya pandangan adalah semua pun betul berbalik kepada national interest. Okay, so that's why I said over and over again, it all goes back to the national interest. You said about history, you said about ethnic, you said about economic. Itu semua adalah contoh national interest. And national interest adalah tidak stagnan. Dia bukan berbentuk statik, dia berbentuk fleksibel. It always change based on situation. Okay, so all conflict can be explained when you look at what the incompatibility in terms of the national interest. That's how you analyze the root cause, what caused the conflict to occurs. Okay. So cause of international conflict, here are 3 main causes of international conflict. Okay, competition over scarce resource, because of very limited resources, everyone going after the same resources, that's when incompatibility to occurs. Okay, competition over scarce resource in South China Sea adalah because of oil and gas, because of fisheries and whatnot. Okay, so fisheries for many years in South China Sea, this fisheries activity become the main concern of the participating claimant countries. Sebabnya misalnya di Indonesia dan Malaysia, nelayan Indonesia selalu melintasi sempadan negara dan menangkap ikan di international water Malaysia. Jadi benda ni selalu menimbulkan ketegangan antara negara. The same goes Vietnam and China as well. Okay, jadi benda tu adalah satu bentuk pelanggaran kedaulatan negara. Okay, fisheries issues, and then oil and gas. Okay, there were reports from Russian articles that claim South China Sea issues ada sumber minyak yang banyak. Jadi itu pun salah satu competition yang berlaku. Okay, so the second one, territorial dispute. Okay, so as everyone knows, China is the only claimant country that claim all South China Sea area. For the other claimant country, they're basing their claim on the EEZ principle, economic exclusive zone principle, which allows you to claim areas 200 meters from your borders. Okay, territorial dispute, it's not only about gaining more areas in your sovereignty, in your borders, it's also about making more influence in the international politics, because when you have more areas, you have more sea lane of communication. Okay, just like in the case of United States. Right? For instance, United States, kenapa dia terlibat dalam South China Sea issue adalah because of sea lane of communication, SLOC, yang mana kalau ada orang, ada pemilikan di kawasan tersebut, kalau kamu limpas macam-macam karena birokrasi yang kamu kena lalui. Kalau tiada orang, mudahlah untuk US lalui kawasan South China Sea, sebabnya South China Sea ini adalah commercial lane. Okay? Laluan komersial untuk kapal-kapal besar. Okay? Contohnya kalau negara-negara ini berjaya mendapatkan South China Sea, dia akan menjadi focal point, yaitu satu kedudukan yang strategik untuk melihat, okay, security issue yang berlaku di South China Sea. So itu adalah disebabkan oleh territorial dispute. And then different ideologies. Okay, so some countries adalah communist country, and some others adalah democracy country. So the reason why United States, even though they are not a claimant country in the South China Sea issue, but still they actively partake in the conflict resolution initiative, because they want to make sure that China does not get the ownership of South China Sea. Okay, sebab they want to make sure that bila China tidak berjaya menguasai South China Sea, maka komunisme itu tidak berkembang. Sebaliknya akan berlaku sekiranya China dapat menguasai South China Sea, maka akan wujud dominoes effect dari satu negara ke negara lain untuk juga adopt communism as way for them to survive the international politics when South China Sea conquer China conquer the South China Sea. Okay, so itu different ideology. Kenapa US terlibat dalam South China Sea? Dua sebab. Sea lane of communication satu, kedua memastikan komunisme tidak tersebar di Southeast Asia. Okay, so again, all these three goes back to national interest. Yeah. Means of leverage. Conflict settled in explicit or implicit way. Acceptable does not mean that both parties are happy or fair. It's about give and take. It's about finding something that can be accepted by both party, even though dia tidak memberi kesemuanya. Sesuatu yang sufficient, yang boleh diterima sahaja, bukanlah yang memenuhi semua permintaan parti yang terlibat. Okay, war violent action taken in international conflict in favorable terms, inflicting violence as a negative leverage. States often have alternative means of leverage better than war. Okay, because of the economic transaction that create interdependence effect on all of the participating members. So, what are mechanisms used to solve dispute? How to resolve conflict? Okay, so aims of conflict resolution is to first promote peace, okay, promote relation, measure for development, practicing tolerance and life in harmony, and last but not least, the most important one, to avoid war. Okay, and how to resolve conflict? Basically kita ada United Nations, ya. United Nations punya outline, a blueprint on how to resolve conflict using peaceful settlement. Yani, okay, if you go to United Nations official website, you can actually download this article. Objective of UN Article 1, bracket 1. Okay, one of the major objectives of United Nations is described in Article 1, bracket 1 of Charters as being to bring about by peaceful means and in conformity with the principle of justice and international law, adjustment or settlement of international dispute or situation which might lead to a breach of the peace. Okay, still, quick reminder, when the states become a member of international organization, they automatically become subjected to the charter of that particular organization. So in United Nations, we have UN Charter. The same goes in ASEAN as well. We have the ASEAN Charter. And it becomes a prerequisite condition for you to be to ratify the treaties before you are eligible to apply for membership in the organization. With that being said, okay, once you become a member of United Nations, you are also subjected to this Article 1, bracket 1. Okay. So Article 33 of United Nations, they outline several methods of peaceful settlement. Okay, we have negotiation, we have a court office, we have bargaining, we have inquiry, consolidation, and arbitration. Okay, so negotiation where you bring the conflicting parties to negotiating the table, and then good office, which involve apa nama dia ni, daripada rakan sejawat ke satu rakan sejawat yang lain, ya. And then bargaining, okay, more or less like negotiation, but you give offers and they counter offer and all that, yeah. It's about persuasion lah. And then inquiries, you inquire, you ask, and then consolidation, it's about how you address the issue lah, basically to consolidate the issue. And the most popular one adalah arbitration. Okay, yang mana you bring the case to International Court of Justice or International Court of Criminal, ICJ or ICC. Okay, yang mana again salah satu prerequisite condition for a country to bring any incompatibility or case to international arbitration is you must be a sovereign state. So if you want to use the example of the Lahad Datu case, diorang tidak boleh bawa benda tu ke international court sebab mereka bukan negara ataupun government yang diiktiraf. Okay, so yang mana yang berlaku baru-baru ni yang dibawa kepada tribunal di Spain tu adalah atas kapasiti individu, bukan kapasiti kerajaan ataupun bukan kapasiti negara. Okay, so itu boleh berlaku. These are all about diplomacy to prevent war and conflict. Okay, so conflict resolution, conflict can be resolved through diplomacy, right? So diplomacy, it's a tool that we use in the persuasion game. Conflict that cannot be solved through peaceful means may lead to war. If diplomacy failed, that's when war become very possible. This conflict may impact surrounding countries in the region and at times even the world. That's why I said it depends on the magnitude of the conflict, right? So it can start off as a very localized, very local conflict, and then it become of a bigger magnitude over time. Okay, just like in the case of the 30 Years' War. Right, so that's all for chapter number 6. Any question for this chapter? We still have about 3 minutes before our session punya hari ini habis. Ada soalan enggak? No. Okay. National government applies to North and South Korea juga kah? Right. So who control national government to applies to North and South Korea juga ke? Yes, yeah, it can be applied in the Korean conflict as well. Looking at the political will from both countries to enter into negotiation. Okay, the most recent attempt to reconcile these two countries was during Trump era. Kan masa waktu Trump tuh yang mana US jadi mediator untuk perbincangan Korea Utara Korea Selatan. That was the last attempt that I aware of lah. I don't know during this Biden era whether they have already initiated another attempt or not. But during Trump era, yes, that one was initiated by him, but again it failed lah. Okay. So if you want to use, if you want to analyze the governmental conflict, kan, conflict over who control national government tu, your focus of analysis should be on the political will. Okay, political will di pihak South Korea dan di pihak North Korea untuk enter negotiation. Okay, menjawab ke Dona? Okay. Any other question? No? Right. So if there's no more question, then that's all for today. Thank you guys for attending class this morning. Go to your future and take your attendance. And I'll see you guys again during tutorial class 2 days from now. Okay? Assalamualaikum.
Thank you, sir.